As we all know by now, COVID-19 has shaken up the travel industry quite a bit. Just a few months ago, it was very normal to travel to another country and cross a border. Today, however, that's very different. And with governments around the world scrambling to get a grip on the spread of the virus, many countries have put in place restrictions that make traveling to the country virtually impossible, or making traveling out of the country and coming home a nightmare with the ever-changing rules and regulations regarding quarantine. You probably know what country I'm talking about. Anyway, my name is Robin, and in this video today we're talking about what it's actually like to travel to Canada in 2020. Firstly, this video is not to talk about whether or not these restrictions work and whether I personally agree with them. This video is to talk about the Quarantine Act in Canada and my personal experience crossing the border of Canada in September of 2020. This was after a brief family visit in Europe, my family that I hadn't seen in almost a year. Also, I'm not an immigration lawyer or in fact any lawyer. I'm also not affiliated with the CBSA. So if you're planning to travel to Canada, make sure that you do your own research because my experiences might not reflect yours. Also, I'm sure you guys have some questions on my purpose and necessity of the travel that I did. I haven't seen my family in over a year, and being the only person of my family living on the other side of the planet, COVID-19 has made that very lonely. And suddenly, the world was a much bigger place than it was before, as traveling is just not as easy anymore. Of course, I did my research and I took all the necessary precautions before I took the trip. I took a COVID-19 test, something that's freely available here in the province. Also, during seat selection, I made sure to sit as far away as possible from any other passengers, which wasn't really a problem to begin with. Anyway, if you still have doubts about the necessity of my travel, the complaints line is open down in the comments below, and I'm sure that the YouTube algorithm loves it. Contrary to popular belief, the Canadian border isn't actually entirely shut. You can still travel to the country. That, of course, is with a few exceptions. Generally spoken, if you're Canadian or you live and work in the country, you can still return home. This is, of course, with a lot of different factors, but that's not really the point of this video. With another few exceptions, anyone coming into Canada has to do a 2-week quarantine, regardless of what country you're traveling from. There are no red countries, yellow countries, or travel corridors. It's a very plain and simple rule. You come into the country, you do a quarantine. And you know, I actually do appreciate that clarity. So, while of course with minimized service, the flight itself wasn't all that different. The true difference was notable when I got to Vancouver Airport. Firstly, it was really quiet there. It was almost freaky. Also, you see sunny stations everywhere and banners reminding you to do your 2-week quarantine. Also, there are several tables where you can sit down and fill out a form. To enforce the Quarantine Act, the Canadian government requires you to fill out a form to give some information about your quarantine plan. This can be done at one of those tables on paper, but you can also use the app or a website 48 hours in advance before your travel. They ask you several things about your flight, but also personal information like your name and passport number. Then, also these questions are being asked. Do you have accommodation where you can quarantine for the next 14 days? Are there vulnerable people at the location where you plan to quarantine? Is the quarantine accommodation a group living environment like group home or senior home, or does it currently house different families? And can you have food, medication, or other necessities delivered to your accommodation while in quarantine? And finally, if you fill out the form on the app 48 hours before you leave, you also have to share whether you have symptoms of COVID-19. Once you get to immigration and customs, things are fairly normal. You line up and then you use one of the machines to fill out your declaration. Then you take your printout from the kiosk and you move on to one of the CBSA officers. This is where things are a little different. You give them your passport, the printout, and your boarding pass. First, the officer assesses your admissibility, basically deciding whether you have reason enough to cross the border. Then they ask questions similar to the questions I answered in the app. Are you aware that you have to go into isolation for 2 weeks upon arrival? Do you have a suitable place to do your isolation at? Do any other vulnerable people live at the place you isolate at? Do you have a way to get groceries and life supplies delivered to you? That wasn't much surprising, although the CBSA officer kept using the word isolation instead of quarantine, and those are clearly two different things. And lastly, I had to prove that I filled out the form using the app by showing the code that the app had generated. I was led through and ready to start my 2 weeks of quarantine. So the first 2 days of my quarantine, nothing really happened. I was just at home doing my quarantine, like you should. But on the third day though, I got a phone call from the government of Canada. What? The government of Canada is calling me? What is this, some joke, or is this Justin Trudeau himself calling me? Or some scam? No, the phone call was totally expected. But if you do, however, decide not to pick it up, they can actually send the RCMP, or the Canadian Police as they call it, to your door to check up on your quarantine. And they have done that several times, and people who break the quarantine laws do actually have to pay fines. They've paid fines up to $250 to $1,000, but they can give fines up to $750,000 or 6 months in jail. So I made sure to quickly pick up the phone to tell them I was compliant. Although it wasn't like that. It wasn't scary at all. It was a friendly guy just asking several questions about my quarantine. It went something like this. Hello.
Hello, this is John from the Canadian government. Am I speaking to Robin?
Yes, sir, that's me.
Okay, thank you. And did you travel into Canada last week?
Yeah, that's correct.
Alright, and can you confirm that you are currently in quarantine?
Yes, I can. And then he asked me a couple other questions as well, such as, are there any other people in your place of quarantine who did not travel? And how do you get your groceries? Did you make any stops to your place of quarantine? How do you get fresh air at your place of quarantine? And did you have any visitors since the start of your quarantine? So it's not really all that scary to get a phone call of the government of Canada. It's just making sure that you do your quarantine and also in a comfortable and humane manner. So the next day, I get another phone call, and this time it's the government of Alberta. As some of you may know, I live in Edmonton, which is the capital of the province of Alberta here in Canada. This phone call is a little different than the call I had the day prior. This time it was more about reminding about the rules of quarantine rather than checking up on whether I was compliant. Again, it was done very friendly and not at all intrusive. The whole system is built around reminding you that you have to do your quarantine. Because aside of these 2 phone calls by actual humans, I've also been receiving notifications in my mailbox and through the ArriveCan app. And if that wasn't reminder enough, on the 7th day I received another phone call. Although, this time I missed it.
FBI, open up!
All jokes aside, it was just a pre-recorded message that went straight to my voicemail, reminding me of the things that I pretty much already knew, like not being able to have any guests and that I couldn't leave my house, yada yada yada. It wasn't anything surprising there. Anyway, 14 days of quarantine is actually quite a long time, but it was well worth it knowing that I had seen my family and that I'm now keeping people safe. Luckily, my family is all healthy, I'm all healthy, and in a few hours when my quarantine ends, I can finally go outside again. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed recording something different than I usually do on my channel. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want more aviation and travel content, please subscribe to the channel. I have a lot of cool videos coming up. If you're planning to travel to Canada yourself, make sure to do your research because the rules and regulations change all the time and my experiences are probably not going to be the same as yours. Thanks again and see you next week.